Good morning. Welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, as you know, today we have lecture on media theory. In fact, we are starting a series of lecture on media theory. Today is the first lecture. So we will try to understand the media and communication theory, its basic, genesis, and interdisciplinary approach, intellectual debate, and many other facets of the media and communication studies. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in studio an eminent faculty, Professor Vishwajit Das. He is an academician, senior faculty, and presently director of Center for Culture and Media Studies, one of the renowned university of the country, in Jamia Millia Islamia University. And he has published a number of articles in different journals, national and international journals, and he has his credit 3 books from Sage Publication. One is the Media and Mediation, the other is Social and Symbolic Communication, the third is Communication, Culture and Confrontation. And there are many manuscripts. In fact, they are ready, but due to lack of time, he is not has not been published, but they are in press. One is the Gandhian Communication, the other is Media, Memory and Modernity, and the other is Colonial Discourse, sorry, and Radio Broadcast in India. So Dr. Das is a true researcher, academician. He is engaged with various work on the communication study and deliver a lecture in different national, international fora. So naturally, his experience and knowledge, vast knowledge, and he is always ready with his own ideas how to understand the communication and how the communication evolved years and what is the intellectual debate going all over the world. So he keep keen eye on this issue. So will help us to understand the today topic on the understanding the media and communication study. So on your behalf, I welcome him for the lecture on this very topic. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Amarendra, for giving me a wonderful opportunity to meet people across the country, no matter not in a physical manner, but through virtual classroom situation. And I'm sure I will have a lot of queries and questions from the students. The title of my talk is Communication Studies from Interdisciplinarity to Discipline of Mass Communication. So I thought it will be just the beginning because in the recent years you find that there is a tremendous upsurge in the country to initiate media institutions, courses are in fact budging across the country. In fact, every other day new nomenclature, new ways of framing courses are going on. So I just thought that probably I would like to get into the kind of intellectual history of communication during its genesis, or you can call it evolution, but I would not like to say evolution. In fact, there are different kinds of histories. One is in the kind of intellectual traditions, at the same time also what are the institutional engagements of communication when it began. Now that's what I just wanted to highlight today in today's lecture. And so in the process also to delve into the idea of interdisciplinarity and disciplinarity of communication. In a way, this lecture would deal with the intellectual history of communication, thereby dealing with intellectuals and their traditions that informed the growth of the field and the rise of the discipline, mostly in North America, which subsequently, that hegemonized the discipline to a large extent prevalent in different parts of the world. Although there are exceptions, as European intellectual traditions have a different roots altogether. But that since we are mostly informed by the North American traditions, hence there was a need to discuss more about what happened in the North American context. So my lecture would focus rather on the North American traditions. Now, while tracing the genealogy of communications in North America, we observe that the earliest communications programs were short-lived interdisciplinary committees at the University of Chicago that were at the forefront of an emerging field but could not sustain due to lack of institutional support. In fact, the early generation of scholars' engagement with the study of communication as a field of inquiry was distinct from journalism training and rhetoric. And the program was mostly funded to undertake research during Second World War, and that subsequently legitimized the field. It was subsequently improvised by incorporating the problem of communication, public opinion, and democracy that occupied the Commission on the Freedom of Press, headed by Chancellor Robert Maynard Hutchins. All of you, I'm sure, must be knowing about Hutchins Commission. In fact, that was the first press commission in the world which came up, Hutchins Commission report. And Hutchins was actually the Chancellor of Chicago University. This enthusiasm opened up a space for an understanding communication research as a field with rationale beyond the study of wartime propaganda. In fact, you find that there is a close connect between the World War, Second World War, and communication research, and even opening up research programs and departments, so on, in the United States. The institutional support determined the health of the field, of course. The committee withered away along with the withdrawal of support. We find that even though this committee, which came up in Chicago to institute research, fundings were mobilized, it also withered away along with the withdrawal of support. But however, while tracing back the roots of mass communication research, we notice that much has been written in the recent years. As Carey, William Carey, as all of you know, one of his important contribution is communication as culture, writes that as Carey points out to a shift, that this shift is from a self-conscious creation to endless recreations. That's what John Carey talks about, that the way initially when communication as a faculty or research initiated, it was a self-conscious creation vis-a-vis other courses, other departments. But today we have gone into what he calls aptly as endless recreations. Others highlight it as a shift from an intellectual to an institutional entity. What is a rather intellectual debates and traditions, now that has been legitimized within an institutional context. That is where in the academia or in the university setups. Hence, it is pertinent to understand what particular versions of history have become so prominent over the years. In 50s, we observed, 1950s I'm talking about, that Wilbur Schramm became the driving force behind the creation of communication study. He oversaw the intellectual conception of the field and its realization in university structure and programs. Schramm built communication programs within already existing journalism schools at prominent universities such as Illinois, Stanford. Wherever he went, he started Institute of Communication Research. So this is a major shift we find. On the one hand, the committee which initiated in Chicago petered out or completely withered away. On the contrary, what Schramm experimented elsewhere, within the university setup, that actually could legitimize and sustain and give it a proper shape of the field itself. As scholars pointed out, Schramm was an intellectual powerhouse. I mean, what scholars talked about, that Schramm was an intellectual powerhouse who sketched the contours of the field itself. He brought together people and the ideas, merged them within the covers of influential books, readers, extended essays and monographs, research monographs. I think he has immensely contributed to the field. I mean, that is why probably we remember Shram very fondly and remember very often whenever we talk about the field of or the discipline of mass communication. I mean, these ideas subsequently inform the assumptions defining the parameters of the field by focusing attention on what you call the social scientific studies on media effects. These studies also contributed to the growth of subfields such as political communication, research on television and children. I mean, there are varieties of subfields which emerged from what Schramm initiated in these university setups. And he also sort of groomed a lot of youngsters, promising scholars, those who came up and wanted to do. That's what I'm trying to say, that although there are scholars who highlight the field of, even though there are scholars during the same time, you find they were still subscribing to or trying to bring out their critical traditions, but they completely its history, like, for instance, their alliance with the Frankfurt School or the pragmatism of Chicago School of Sociology, but they remain completely subsumed in the historiography of American communication. It means that along with what Schramm has been writing, there is also the time when you find within North America there is an alternative traditions also equally emerging, but however they were completely subsided. For your information, you find that the whole Frankfurt scholarship initiated by Theodor Adorno and others, those who migrated because of the Nazism in Germany, they all migrated to United States, and they also subsequently contributed, but however their contribution has not been recognized within the larger historiography of American communication research. I mean, as we know that Chicago is is known as a birthplace of pragmatism, and more generally of an American social science. This was a social science engaged with tangible problems of urban life and determined to make a difference. As such, mass communication and its role in society had been on the research agenda at the University of Chicago since its inception. In fact, one of the prominent figure, Harold Laswell, contributed to developing communication research at Chicago. Laswell, in fact, a teacher of political science, taught in political science the importance of communications, and that is where he was engaged with the questions of public opinion, propaganda, and these were the issues Laswell was engaged ever since he was a part of University of Chicago. Besides Harold Laswell, there was a very important figure which we have not much heard in our communication studies, is Douglas Waples. In fact, you'll be surprised to know that Douglas Waples was appointed in the Graduate Library School, who subsequently became a key figure in communication research at Chicago. Many of the ideas grounding communication research at Chicago in the social sciences came about during this early period of interdisciplinary collaboration. The wartime research effort was the single most important catalyst for the new field of mass communication research. World War II legitimized work on mass communication research by guaranteeing funding and support, as well as bringing together scholars from around the country, that is in North America, interested in studying media and persuasion. The war and mobilization of research energies that surrounded it created a paradigm of communication research that was also to the focus the field in the subsequent era toward the demands of the Cold War. It means we find that mostly these scholars in Chicago, they contributed immensely to understand the war period and propaganda, public opinion, even subsequently what you find the entire defense, in fact what you call the psychological warfare. So this is where you find that our communication has contributed immensely. In fact, Douglas Waples is a figure, I mean, who is quite unknown to most of the communication scholars. I mean, what Bernard Berelson, writes in an obituary in 1979, I mean, who credits Wepels with the birth of academic field of mass communication. Wepels launched an ambitious program of mass communication research. I mean, his expertise in areas relevant to the propaganda effort earned him the job of consultant to the Office of War Information during World War II. In this capacity, he worked with other colleagues such as Harold Laswell, Samuel Stopher, and also with a network of scholars such as, Ulvis Ram, Paul Lajaspel, Carl Hobland, and also Margaret Mead. I mean, his work on the use of mass media in the context of a national emergency was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. I mean, in bringing together top scholars from a variety of discipline to study the role of mass media in persuasion in the interwar years. I mean, the foundation support laid the groundwork for a new field, as Bernard Berelson notes, that modern version of communication research began with the development of both academic and commercial interests. So you find that this is where largely there is a combination which grew, that we sort of try to engage industry or commercial interest along with the academic interest. In fact, by the same time, we find that there was another major report which came out that contributed immensely, that is by Hutchins. This is called the Hutchins Commission. I mean, headed by Hutchins, this commission, that was actually on the freedom of press, headed by Chicago's chancellor. I mean, he was the chancellor. It is best known for its extensive work on social responsibility of the press. What is less known is the role of committee played in carving out a justification of mass communication research within the university as separate from the practical journalism tradition that Wilbur Ram represented, as well as from this propaganda paradigm that generated so much of the early research. The understanding of what it meant to study communication had shifted. I mean, what we see in the post-war years, that there was a gradual shift in understanding communications. We see that no longer it was compelled by the urgency of the war. The Chicago scholars who were interested in communication research concentrated their efforts understanding the role of media, or you call understanding the place of media in democratic societies. I think one of the major shifts which took place after the World War was this: how to locate the role of media in democracies. So probably that was a major shift which sort of tried to, even though you find, despite broadening the interest of the committee, it continued to operate within the dominant paradigm. You see, the question is, even though the focus might have shifted from what the studies or the areas which were suggested earlier in terms of looking at public opinion, propaganda. Now sort of they try to shift about how to use communications in how media can play a very constructive or a proactive role in democracies. You find that even though there is a slightly a shift which took place, however, you find invariably they were informed by the dominant paradigm of the war period. That is how you find that they could not graduate, they could not go beyond that tradition. So this is where we see that the dominant paradigm, which was strengthened by the realities of the Cold War. I mean, in fact, if the committee represented an early effort at establishing the field of mass communication research, its interest could be seen as symptomatic of a larger trend. More than anything, the work of the committee signaled the rise of mass communication research, tied as it was to the interest of army and government. In fact, and not going to break free easily from its moorings. So you find that there was a strong connect between the way communication evolved and developed in the Chicago context, the way the committee focused on looking at the issue of public opinion, propaganda. They could not get out of that moorings, even though in the post-war context, in the Cold War period, they sort of wanted to work on. However, they could not move ahead of it. Rather, you find that they were caught within the same moorings. I mean, in fact, the committee was, in most respect, a product of its times. However, it also enabled experimentation and innovation in the methods and problems of research. I think one of the major contributions in terms of experimentation and innovations in research is that they also moved from what you call from a case study analysis to various survey research which actually took place. In fact, this also reminds me, if we look back to another very important figure during that particular time is Lajasfeld, HMS Lajasfeld, who started, who started doing for Rockefeller Foundations, doing on most of the research on radio, started that Institute of Applied Research in Columbia University, and that is where he did immense research and contributed to your entire research methods in communications or even in social sciences. You find that the quantitative techniques, what he evolved, studying on the message analysis, the consumers, and so on. In fact, that was a path breaking which came up in terms of what you call an empiricism tradition in communications that it emerged. I mean, despite the diverse background and interest of the individuals involved in the committee, there was a broad agreement on its unique approach to communication research. It was interested in approaching communication as a set of intellectual questions. I mean, they were rather more engaged communications more as questions rather than the offspring of journalism training. Journalism was studied by these groups, but only on a theoretical level in courses on content analysis. So they were not interested in journalism training per se. They were sort of trying to engage with communication questions. But however, I think there was, they were not able to institutionalize. However, the nature of questions were always interested them, even though people came from a diverse kind of backgrounds. And there were many reasons for the committee's decline. I mean, one can say that, of course, there are enormous studies have been undertaken and trying to show that there were many reasons for the committee's decline. I mean, the most obvious having to do with its underlying structures, as one of the important scholar, Eliuk, has suggested, Chicago committees are supposed to die in the sense of being loose coalitions of people who often decoalesce. I mean, that's a very interesting way of framing it. There was a loose coalitions of people who often decoalesce. I mean, you look at the kind of people who were engaged in this particular committee which was formed in Chicago. People came from diverse backgrounds, like from library science, political science, sociology, and so many others from network technology studies and so on. They all were engaged because the major motive was war and what happens during war and how to develop a counter as well as to create a kind of a proper and control the public opinion. I think these were probably the questions which they were engaged and which they also tried to philosophize. But however, they could not come up after the war. I think probably war ended with their questions, and after that probably they were not much interested, or as a result you find a lot of these people, they just completely drifted apart and also left. But at least there was a promise which they created during that time. So one should not forget that as a part of history, and which is very important. And there was an immense contribution which even SRAM also learned a lot from that particular debates in Chicago. I mean, what you find is that even though the philosophy of interdisciplinary committee was embraced by the institution, its practice was fraught with administrative instability and fragility. I mean, the question arises, why is it easy to conclude? I mean, the question arises that even though before Wilbur Ram, there were so many scholars, so many intellectuals who contributed to communications, but why they have been completely foregone in the history, or they have been completely not remembered at all in the memory of any communication scholarship, or even why it is easy to conclude that SRAM was probably the founder of field of mass communication research. Why is it that we have forgotten the first attempt that took place at the University of Chicago? I mean, as Berelson wrote in the obituary of communication study, based on the idea that the kinds of research questions pursued by the earliest communication scholars had been exhausted, and the founding fathers of communication study had given up on it and moved to the greener pastures. I think after the war, most of these scholars, they moved, whether it is Hopland, you find Laswell, so many other scholars, they moved from, and they shifted, and that is where probably, and what Berelson concludes by saying that the innovations of 15 to 25 years ago have been wearing out, and that no new ideas of comparable scope are appearing to take place after the war, you find. Whereas you find that Wilbur Ram saw communication as an extraordinary vital field with a competent intellectual group of young researchers facing a challenged set of problems. SRAM revealed in his view of communication research, as a discipline within the university, as an institutional entity. I mean, this is how we find that communication studies survived as an institutionalized project of inquiry under his competent tutelage. He formed the discipline as a home for a range of ideas and research agendas. In doing so, he stabilized the course of mass communication research. I think this is why we remember Wilbur Ram very often as the founding father of communications, which was located within the institutional setups. So history, whenever we write intellectual history, we write about what we call the institutional history. One is an institutional history. Other one is what is the intellectual traditions during that particular time. So we try to bring all of them together to develop and understand a perspective to understand communication. I think I will leave it here. I can field more questions so that will be a better way of doing it. Thank you.
Okay. As you say, there are different approaches, and we will, in subsequent lecture, we will also include and will try to focus on certain specific issues. But as you said, that we have intellectual history, we have institutional history, we try to include the different discourse went on while evolving the mass communication or communication as a discipline and institutions. But can you little bit talk about the problem and the barrier which was during these periods not helped much, and it took so much time in evolving communication as a discipline?
I think one of the reasons is communication was studied more as a program, more as a research questions. So you find that when communication was formally studied, and that was studied in Chicago. Chicago as such, you know that it was a university which was framed within a Germanic tradition. It was funded by Rockefeller Foundation, and these are all Ivy League institutions, and so there is a scope for innovations. And this is also the time of Second World War. Remember, prior to that, America was never a part of the war.
So was it because of the war? It was an effort of few intellectuals, but it doesn't have in the initial. It was not visualized that it possesses the ingredients of a discipline. It's just like this.
A research program.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. That it was more, you see, you need to understand before it has been institutionalized.
Okay.
And it has been brought within an academia or kind of located within universities so that it is structured around courses. Prior to that, already there is an amount of solid research which has gone in, but this research exclusively focused on during the World War. This research came up. Now, think about, you see, why we are getting into these questions. I would gradually reveal that most of the undergraduate courses or postgraduate courses in Indian universities where conventionally they have been studying on journalism. Now, they often use, these models, like talking about Shannon and Weber, all kinds of models. They all came up during this time. And there was a context, there was a necessity for which it came. So that's why I wanted to start with an idea about getting into this whole program, in which context it came. In fact, when physicists like Norbert Wiener, Wilbur Schramm, a Bell company at telecommunication engineer, sort of trying to develop these models of communication, they are actually doing during the war. During the war, they are actually trying to understand what you call the cybernetics or even information flow. They are actually even Harold Laswell. So let's not forget about the context in which our so-called forefathers have or scholars have contributed. Probably we are completely devoid of that history. We are devoid of that history, and this is how in North America communication scholarship is growing. Of course, in the later years, subsequent years, the scholars have completely critiqued. That is no more. But however, you find in most parts of the world, still they are being taught as the models. So I think even what was my interest was to engage with what is the difference between a theory and a model.
Right.
You see, invariably we think that models and theories are same, which is not. Because you see, they are actually talking about models. I mean, models are not, theory is a basic science. Theory is a basic science. From theory, you can generate a lot of models. If the ideas are clear, then on the basis of that, you can experiment with a model. And that's what Shannon and Weber did. But we can't say that models replicate or models are alternative to theory, which is not. So there is a difference between that. But during 1940s and 50s, the way experiments were undertaken, the committees were formed, a kind of an interdisciplinary engagement. It is also very interesting to know, on the one hand, in Chicago you find there is an engagement with the community. Let me tell you, start with the idea about Robert Ezra Park. Robert Ezra Park, who has done immense work, contributed to understand about the role of press in forging a sense of community. I mean, if you find that Park studies, which actually came up, that how through newspaper you can forge a sense of community. The question arises, why is it that you are talking about forging a sense of community? Is it that there is no sense of community? A newspaper will bring and forge that sense of community? I mean, how does one address this in an American context and in an Indian context? Probably the question of community is different in the United States than in India. I think the question of community never existed. I mean, prior to, if you look back to the history of United States, I think there was no sense of community, because migrants migrating from different parts of the world and trying to settle down. This is across linguistic, across countries, geographical. So to bring them and forge a sense of community where newspaper or media can play a role, that is what scholars have been sort of trying to study in the urban context, or even Chicago was mostly engaged in an urban context. So that is where you find, on the one hand, scholars are engaged in understanding how communities can be forged. On the other hand, you find the contribution of technology, or in the physics, in the laboratories, where you find is completely trying to develop or evolve mechanism to predict, understand, or even the missiles of the war. So you find Norbert Wiener trying to develop this whole idea of missiles, which is where, missiles you can predict. It's a prediction that you are hitting a target. The first one can miss. The second one, it will give you a sense of idea, the speed, the velocity in which it is moving, and it gives back you the feedbacks. The notion and the idea of feedback is actually coming from there. So now what in media studies, or conventionally we guys talk about feedbacks, is actually, it was Norbert Wiener's contribution that he's sort of trying to study on feedbacks of the missiles, which is that subsequently has been translated. So we find that these concepts, even in post-50s of the post-war, we find that we have mindlessly borrowed those ideas without questioning. I think that is one of the reasons.
Yeah.
So SRAM in that sense probably contributed immensely to the expansion, because 50s also is the time where you find nation states, internationalization of media, and in the Cold War period you cannot directly intervene. So the focus, the scope was different, and SRAM did a splendid job during 50s.
And moreover, that people have realized the potential and importance of communication, how did it play during the World War I and World War II.
Yeah,
So,
they contributed, they developed technologies, they developed ideas,
yeah.
and that is how they championed. But there is a different history and roots as well in other parts of the world. I just talked about the North American tradition.
Yeah, why you say that there was no sense of community, and we see that now when the network society is coming on,
Yeah.
the role of communication will become more important.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
And how do you see in this given scenario, the coming network society, which will likely to see in coming decade or whatever complete. So the communication studies will unfold
Um,
because the new media has already come. So the focus would be on the new media, or something else. Do you see from here?
you see, I have little reluctance to use the term new media, because I find the idea of media has never become old. So we say that when we say new media, as if our media conventional, I understand what you mean by, is a non-interactive media. You basically would like to say mass media are old, so we now get into interactive media, which is a new media. That's what probably you are
In
trying
the mind
to
of people.
people refer. But I tell you that if you look at the idea of new and old historically, the history of media is not that old. So history of media is not that old. Might be a history of 300 years, mass media 400 years, not beyond that. So that history is too short. I mean, when you study as a a historian of media, you find that it's too. Probably media scholarship, sort of the media scholars try to think it, or communication scholars think about media in that sense. That is old. The new media they talk about. That is one area where there is a lot of work, scholarship going on at the moment. But as you rightly pointed out about network societies, I think gradually we find that in social science also in a big way you find like Manuel Castro writes about network societies, and the kind of capital is shifting, the relations are shifting, the technology, labor is shifting. So you find that what Manuel Castro talks about, the information society, what Daniel Bell referred earlier. Now again we are talking about Manuel Castro's. You see, the issue is these are ideas, these are borrowed from the West. These are ideas borrowed from the West. We are sort of trying to look at within Indian context. But certainly there is a change which is occurring. There is a change which is occurring. and change is likely to occur more and more. But why this change is occurring? One of the, I think we are also experiencing the idea of digitization. We are also experiencing the idea of digitization without questioning to what extent that digitized technology can sustain and provide an alternative to the analog technology. At least we know about analog technologies that which has been preserved for, let's say, hundreds of years. But what will happen to digital technology? In a touch of a button, it is just erased. So nobody knows today, but the fashion is to get into the digital. But when at the front of technology you find there is a digitization, the society is also undergoing a kind of a digitization. In a sense, you find that we all would like to remain in a network of relations. We all would like to remain in a network of relations. In a touch of a button screen, I would like to have informations which are all uploaded in the websites, and that is where we would like to work. That is how the modern times are becoming, that we are all in networks. Now, as Amarendra rightly pointed out, that what is the difference? Now, we are moving ahead from what you call a hierarchized structure to a network structure. In a hierarchized structure, at least there was a hierarchy like A and B. Now in a network, A and B are in a parallel relations. It's just like there are multiple relations. It's not like A instructing B. It is like A and B together in a circular form. So I think there is no called before and after. What modernity taught us, that there is always a beginning, there is an end. Now we are all in a seriality. So that is the future we are moving towards. I think when we talked about one of the major questions of modernity is that it always started from somewhere, a beginning and an end we are entering into. But when we say a networked society, we are all engaged in a network of relations. So everybody is there in the loop. Everybody is in the loop. But there is nothing called beginning, there is nothing called end. So the question is the future. It's too early to say, but to know that whether we are moving towards that kind of relations. But technology is giving us that sense of feel that we are all in a network of relation. So I'm sort of trying to give you an idea that at the ideational level, you find that the notion of networked relation or network society means how it is going to affect our relations. In fact, that society, everything will be available in the networks. Now, everything is available in the networks because of high speed of interactivity. Everything is available in the networks, so we can work anywhere. So the notion of work will shift, the notion of family will shift, the notion of industry will shift, because everybody will prefer to work anywhere. So whether your workplace can be home, your workplace can be industry, your workplace can be office. So anywhere you can sit and do work. So because we are all connected in the networks. So we are still waiting that in what way that actually is leading to. It's too early to make a judgment and pronouncement because we are yet to get into that, except that we have borrowed these ideas from the West, like we talk about information society, network society, and network relations. Imagine the politics, the way. In fact, these ideas actually are created by some of the CEOs from the Microsoft companies. And that is where they talk about what they call it. It's a friction-free capitalism in a way that everything, you see, if you see the idea of this whole interactivity is coming up because you find that the former portals which were there, and there was a portal crisis like 01. There was a crisis because they all failed. Then when Web 02 came, suddenly we find that there is an enormous opportunity of interactivity. So the idea is that everything we get it as a free lunch, like you talk about the Facebook, you talk about the Twitter, you talk about everything is free. Everything is free. Now the question is it free or something else? This is too early to make a judgment. So I'm saying that, look, like you talk about Wikipedia, everything is coming free at the cost of something else. So what the CEOs of these companies are sort of trying to say that, look, we provide them free of cost. So interactivity, friction free, so more market and e-commerce would increase much faster so than anything else. So if there is a faster speed of doing e-commerce, so that, that is where capitalism's modern, the mantra is moving towards, to that one needs to seriously think about, rather than thinking about technology at the level. In fact, it talks about social factory. In fact, that anybody can chip in anywhere to Wikipedia, but we forget that that is also controlled. It's not that you contribute to Wikipedia. So there is no history. It is an endless creation and recreation. That's what I would like to add there.
Well, that is true, but when we go to relation between the, we see agriculture to industrial, industrial to service imported, then now the information, as a information society or network society, we find the relationship between physical and intellectual has not been so vivid as we see. Only now, only intellectual ability you should have, but in industrial or agriculture, intellectual and physical both energy or both be needed. So this gap, physical, no need of doing the physical things, and you get everything, or as you said, the free. How this will have impact in the you say in business or in all the sphere of life, all walks.
You see, it's actually, we have been studying different ages, and like in communication also we try to study the mode of production of communications, and where we say that from agricultural forms, horticultural, agricultural forms, like I would say that orality, like you talk about orality, speech. Speech communities.
Yeah, in communication we
speech
can
communities. Let me rephrase these concepts or conceptual tools to understand our societies, the evolution of our societies. I would say that the speech communities. Now, within the speech communities, the nature of communication was direct, physical, face-to-face interactions, and it was a small-scale principalities within which communications. It was a two-way interactions, and communication was complete in a sense that what I spoke, you responded back to me, and I replied you back. So that is how the communication is complete. But now we move to spatial forms of communication, because expansion of space. Now so we cannot meet each other very often. So in that context, it was the mediation. And the mediation of communications, where we talk about, we brought technology as forms, and forms through which we sort of try to communicate. But in the process of bringing technology to the forms of communications, now it also provided a sense of storing capacity, retrieval capacity. But there was an instituted break between the production and reception of communications. Like in the earlier forms, a communication was complete when between you and me, we tried to engage in a dialogue and we completed it. Now, thanks to technology, you can record this lecture. You can even show it, rather than making a direct telecast. You can show it after a year, after 6 months. Probably the context should be different to show it, and that is where you find that now media provides that space to store it, to retrieve it, to reproduce it, and that is where you find media has given it. It might be out of context, but at least it provides that space. But at the same time, now what you were saying is that media here contributed not only in the history of societies, where you find how also provided a sense of imagining communities and identities and so on. That's how it happened. But here we started with the idea of orality and speech communications, but this is where we are talking about in Indian context historically, if you want to say, then I would like to say about print communication. like colonialism. I mean, historically, I would like to say colonialism and print came. You know that, I mean, even though we talk about that in India, there was nothing printed, recorded history. I mean, it's only colonialism is the point of departure where we take that. During colonialism, we had a lot of literature, and where even the colonial officials, what you call Orientalism, where you find the colonial officials sort of try to study Sanskrit, study Persian, sit with them, translate it in English. So that is where the whole body of knowledge which came. That is what we call it, kind of an Orientalist kind of discourse. And because we are trying to see our own society through their spectacles, that's the idea. So how a Westerner thinks about our society, we think or we see our own society through their eyes. So now we have demystified it. But that idea of literacy, once literacy came, a bunch of people were being branded as illiterates. Once literacy came, a bunch of people were branded as illiterates. They were all socially illiterate, and these people were suddenly made to realize, in fact, I would like to refer to settlement policies. These were the forms of control and government or governmentalities, where you find the moment settlements came in India, you find the way settlements were recorded so settlement became a form of control in our societies, because these were the recorded
talking about permanent settlement in 1793.
Yeah, that actually gave an idea, because those who know the ability to read and write could actually create their own record of rights. And this is where, if you recall the Sunset Laws, so literacy created a bunch of illiterates. But prior to that, there was no distinction between literates and illiterates. The same thing happened in African societies also. When literacy came, suddenly a speech community, there was a tremendous loss. Within the speech community, because now new forms came. So here literacy is form of a technology. Literacy is an art, a form of technology, and that is what is being initiated. But today, you see, even that literacy, you talk about modern media, electronic media. So you find historically we have not yet ventured to the analysis of such engagements in understanding our own history, our societies and our culture. I'm sure in future more and more scholars should look at it rather than in a sectoral manner.
Now we'd like to ask you last question from where we have started. Generally students get confused because media theory and communication theory. What are the major difference and how one should understand it?
I think you see, one should more engage with communication theory. I mean, these are loosely used terms. Media theory, what is a media theory? There cannot be a theory of media, let me tell you. There cannot be a theory of media. These are technologies. I mean, we need to engage, even though there is a lot of writings now coming of media theory. You see, there is one group of bunch of scholars, those who write about, they call it medium theory, not a media theory. They call it a medium theory. In fact, what we were discussing about the history and media, in that sense, even speech is a medium, which has been, of course, unfortunately, not incorporated within your conventional framework of mass communication. But if you read Raymond Williams and others, they talk about that the idea of mass communication is deeply and disastrously deformed, because by excluding the term orality or speech from the mass media, you see, mass communications. So mass is a very, very industrialized mode of communications. When you say mass media, you are talking about industrialized, organized way of communications. Like you talk about radio, you can't have a communication of radio without a proper organizational structure and industry. Similarly, like television or print or cinema, you see. So So now, when you say media theory, you see, actually, it's a whole bunch of scholars. Like I would rather suggest that students should read Harold Innis more. Harold Innis more, because Harold Innis, in his bias of communications, has been referring to understanding from what you call, the whole the Egyptian civilization, and also where the way even prior to speech, the way the technology of communications emerge, and that is where you find that we try to understand. That is a medium perspective of communication. But after all, when we say theory, medium theory, so like Joshua Merowiz and so many other scholars, there is a what you call, these are group. This is a particular group. Let me clarify. They're called media ecologists. They're called media ecologists. And in Canada, in fact, the followers of Harold Innis, that also partly some scholars like Neil Postman is another, and they have been contributing in this field of what you call, medium theory. But when we loosely use the term media theory, I'm a little suspicious, and rather we should more and more focus on communication theory. Now, I think this is probably today a fashion to everybody talking about media theory without knowing the grounding. Media cannot per se have a theory. Like you can't say television theory, you see. So theories are much broader.
So
theories are much broader.
Use the medium theory.
Yeah, medium theory you can say. Then medium theory, once you say there is a particular school of thought, there's a particular school of thought that is called the media ecologist. They have been contributing, trying to understand that it is the medium which can transform society. I mean, that might be a very, very deterministic, a technologically deterministic way of looking at transformation. However, you find that there are a set of scholars who have been sort of trying to study in a very deterministic note. So now when you say media theory, it's nothing but a very, very hard sense of determinism. That's what I'm trying to say. So I think theory is much broader. Let's not reduce.
So yeah, we can say the media and communication theory.
Yeah,
That makes sense.
Yeah, because I think we just use communication theories or theoretical perspectives to understand communications.
Okay.
That's all.
So, well friends, with these words, we'd like to conclude the lecture. I thank you, all of you, for watching the lecture, and on behalf, I thank Professor Vishjit Das for giving such an insightful lecture. Thank you very much.